At 8:15 in the morning on February 28, 2026, the sky over Tehran was no longer the peaceful blue of a Ramadan morning. It was torn apart by the whistling sound of Tomahawk cruise missiles and the roar of fifth-generation stealth fighter squadrons. In an instant, the heart of the Islamic Republic of Iran literally stopped beating when Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had held absolute power for more than 35 years, was confirmed dead right on the grounds of his office on Pasteur Street. This was not just an ordinary airstrike. It was a historic political decapitation carried out by the United States and Israeli coalition under the codename Operation Majestic Rage. This event immediately plunged the Middle East into an uncontrollable whirlwind of chaos, where the boundary between strategic victory and global catastrophe became more fragile than ever. Chaos engulfed the entire Iranian leadership as thick black smoke billowed from the ruins of the most important government buildings. The survivors in the Supreme National Security Council faced a brutal reality that almost the entire top leadership had been wiped out in less than 30 seconds. Along with the Ayatollah, more than 40 top generals and officials, including the Minister of Defense and elite commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, were killed in a precision strike that was staggering. The world watched with bated breath through live news reports, not only because a large-scale war had broken out, but because they were witnessing the most dangerous power vacuum in the modern history of the Persian Gulf. The urgent question at that time was not who would retaliate, but who was still authorized to give orders to the millions of soldiers who were holding their guns. At the Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, President Donald Trump followed live intelligence reports from the Situation Room with a look of complete confidence. He did not hesitate to declare on social media that the number one enemy had been eliminated, and now was the time for the Iranian people to stand up and reclaim their freedom. However, behind those grand statements was a high-risk geopolitical gamble that many military experts called a serious miscalculation. Washington had expected a chain reaction collapse or an instant revolution from the people after the brain was severed. But they underestimated Tehran's sophisticated four-tier succession structure, designed to survive even in an apocalyptic scenario. Iran was not like Venezuela or any other country the United States had intervened in before. It was a labyrinth of power shadows, always waiting to rise from the rubble. While the body of the Ayatollah still lay under the debris, fierce internal power struggles began to take place inside secret underground bunkers. The script of a 10-minute leader began to take shape as the remaining clerics scrambled to find a face to reassure the military and prevent the total collapse of the regime. The rise of this new leader took place as United States military bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates were being hit by relentless waves of automated retaliatory missiles. Iran's decentralized defense system, known as Mosaic, had been activated, allowing local units to fire without waiting for orders from the center. This was the beginning of a terrifying era, where a new master of Iran stepped to the pinnacle of glory only to see his throne immediately burn under the heat of thousands of tons of bombs that continued to fall. In the deepest, most fortified layers of the Tehran underground, within a bunker engineered to withstand the thermal pressure of a nuclear blast, the remaining members of the Assembly of Experts and the Supreme National Security Council gathered in a suffocating atmosphere. Outside, the rhythmic, bone-deep thumping of Operation Majestic Rage continued to shake the concrete foundations, a constant reminder that the world above was being reshaped by fire and steel. The precision of the American and Israeli strikes had been terrifying. In less than 30 seconds, the entire top tier of the Iranian leadership had been liquidated in a single, coordinated wave of destruction. With the Ayatollah, the Minister of Defense, and the commander of the Quds Force gone, a massive power vacuum threatened to collapse the state from within. In a desperate attempt to maintain order and project an image of continuity, a name was put forward to fill this void. A mid-level cleric who would soon be known to history as the 10-minute leader. The air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone from overworked electronics and the metallic tang of pure fear as these men realized they were the last survivors of a regime that had stood for nearly 5 decades. Iran's succession protocol was a sophisticated 4-layer system designed for exactly this kind of catastrophe, ensuring that the light of the revolution would never be extinguished even under the most extreme circumstances. However, the sheer effectiveness of the decapitation strike had paralyzed the process at every level. The Assembly of Experts could not gather enough members for a legal vote, as many were trapped in the burning remains of their homes or killed in the initial wave of precision-guided munitions. Amidst the panic and the sound of distant secondary explosions echoing through the ventilation shafts, surviving military commanders from the lower ranks of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps pressured a minor religious figure into taking an emergency oath of office. They needed a face for the cameras and a voice to tell the millions of mobilized Basij members and regular army soldiers that the fight was not over. This transition happened as Iranian missile batteries, operating under the decentralized Mosaic Defense Doctrine, began launching retaliatory strikes against American bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. These units were not waiting for central authorization. They were programmed to fire the moment the link to Tehran was severed. The new Supreme Leader was rushed to a secure, underground broadcast studio to deliver a war manifesto intended to ignite the spirits of the faithful and signal to the world that Iran had not yet fallen. But his authority was an illusion from the very start. In Washington, President Donald Trump was already active on social media, labeling the new government a weak C-team and calling for a civilian uprising to finish what the missiles had started. Simultaneously, Western intelligence agencies began flooding Iranian social media with deep-fake evidence and leaked recordings suggesting that the new leadership was already fracturing into rival factions, with some supposedly preparing to surrender. The 10-minute leader's first and only broadcast was intended to project strength, but it was plagued by technical failures caused by massive cyber attacks that had already crippled more than 50% of the nation's internet traffic and disrupted the state-run media network. He was speaking to a nation that could barely hear him, and to a military that no longer recognized a single point of command. The chaos was not just physical, it was digital and psychological, a total war on the Iranian national identity. As the leader attempted to issue orders to stop the uncoordinated shelling of civilian areas in neighboring countries, fearing that such acts would trigger a total NATO invasion and the permanent occupation of the country, he realized he had no real control over the forces he supposedly led. Local units, following the strict and violent protocols of the Mosaic Doctrine, ignored his calls for restraint, believing them to be enemy psychological warfare or the words of a captive leader speaking under duress. Just as he realized the futility of his position and the weight of the crown he had just accepted, an urgent alert from the bunker's electronic warfare unit confirmed that their location had been geolocated by the enemy. It wasn't a spy or a traitor that betrayed them, but a unique radio frequency emitted by the aging broadcast equipment itself. His mien of power vanished in an instant, replaced by the cold terror of an incoming strike. High above the clouds, a B-2 Spirit bomber had already released a pair of 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators. The 10-minute reign was about to conclude not with a political shift or a surrender, but with the total structural failure of the bunker and the end of the last remnants of the old guard. The impact of the two 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators was not merely a sound, it was a tectonic shift that rippled through the very bedrock of Tehran. For those few remaining officials and the newly minted leader, the end came with a roar of compressed air and the total collapse of their subterranean world. The 10-minute leader, whose name had barely been registered by international news agencies, was gone before his first official decree could even be transmitted to the frontline troops. In Washington and Tel Aviv, the initial reports of the bunker's destruction were met with cheers and a sense of absolute triumph. High-ranking officials believed they had successfully executed a double-tap decapitation strike that would leave the Iranian state paralyzed, forcing a swift surrender or a total internal collapse. However, as the dust settled over the crater that was once a command hub, the reality of the situation began to emerge on the glowing screens of the Pentagon's Situation Room. They had not killed the beast, they had only shattered its central nervous system, leaving dozens of smaller, more aggressive limbs to act on their own deadly instincts. This was the moment the Mosaic Defense Doctrine moved from a theoretical strategy to a terrifying reality. Developed over decades to counter the overwhelming technological superiority of the United States, this doctrine transformed every local commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps into an independent warlord with the authority to launch his entire arsenal without waiting for a signal from the capital. As the central government in Tehran ceased to exist as a functional entity, the theater of war expanded with shocking speed. From the mountains of Zagros to the shores of the Persian Gulf, hidden missile silos opened their concrete eyelids. Within minutes of the second leader's death, hundreds of short-range ballistic missiles and thousands of suicide drones were launched toward American installations in Riyadh, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. The sky over the Middle East became a chaotic web of fire and steel as Patriot and Iron Dome batteries struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of the incoming swarm. The precision-guided war that Washington had envisioned was rapidly devolving into a decentralized, multi-front nightmare of attrition. The global economy felt the shockwaves almost instantly. As news of the continued strikes and the absence of any central Iranian authority reached the markets, the price of crude oil spiked to over $200 per barrel in a matter of hours. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most critical maritime choke point, became a graveyard of burning tankers and drifting mines. Insurance companies immediately revoked coverage for any vessel entering the region, effectively shutting down the primary artery of global energy. While President Trump continued to post messages of liberation and victory, the intelligence community was sounding the alarm. They were no longer fighting a country. They were fighting a ghost. The lack of a central leader meant there was no one to negotiate with, no one to sign a ceasefire, and no one to stop the escalating violence that was now spilling over into Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. The dream of a quick regime change was being replaced by the grim realization that they had opened a door to a house filled with fire, and the door had just locked behind them. Inside Tehran, the situation was even more dire. With the leadership gone and communication networks shattered, the civilian population found themselves caught between the hammer of coalition carpet bombing and the anvil of desperate, leaderless security forces. Rumors of a third successor, an even more radical figure from the depths of the security apparatus, began to circulate, but there was no way to verify anything. The city was a landscape of smoke, sirens, and fear. Families huddled in basements, listening to the constant drone of aircraft and the thunder of explosions that seemed to have no pattern or end. The international community watched in horror as the humanitarian crisis reached unprecedented levels, with millions of people attempting to flee toward the borders of Turkey and Iraq. The 10-minute leader's fall had not brought the promised peace. It had only accelerated the descent into a dark age of regional instability that threatened to pull the entire world into its gravity. The smoke rising from the ruins of the Pasteur Street complex was more than just a signal of a fallen regime. It was the birth of a headless monster. With the 10-minute leader dead and the central command obliterated, the Islamic Republic transitioned into what historians would later call the Age of the Ghost Council. In the total absence of a visible head of state, the regional commanders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began to operate with a level of autonomy that was both impressive and terrifying. In the city of Isfahan, a brigadier general took it upon himself to seize control of the nuclear facilities, not to safeguard them, but to use them as a final bargaining chip against the encroaching coalition forces. Meanwhile, in the southern ports, naval units began a systematic campaign of suicide boat attacks against any vessel, military, or civilian that dared to enter the Persian Gulf. The war had ceased to be a strategic campaign. It had become an existential spasm of a dying giant, lashing out at everything within reach. At the United Nations in New York, the atmosphere was one of funeral-like solemnity mixed with frantic, whispered negotiations. The Russian and Chinese delegations found themselves in an impossible position. While they had long criticized American interventionism, the total disintegration of the Iranian state represented a catastrophic threat to their own energy security and regional interests. Beijing, in particular, was reeling from the $200 per barrel oil price, which threatened to stall its massive industrial engine. They called for an immediate ceasefire, but there was a fundamental problem that rendered diplomacy useless. There was no one left in Tehran with the authority to sign a treaty. The American State Department's attempts to reach out to moderate elements within the Iranian bureaucracy were met with silence or the sounds of gunfire. The vacuum was so absolute that it had begun to suck in the stability of neighboring nations. Turkey and Iraq struggled to manage the waves of hundreds of thousands of refugees, while the global supply chain began to fracture under the weight of a closed Strait of Hormuz. Back in Washington, the initial euphoria of the decapitation strike had been replaced by a grim realization. The intelligence community, led by the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Defense Intelligence Agency, was working around the clock to identify who, if anyone, was actually in charge. They tracked encrypted signals originating from the mountains of Mashhad, suggesting the existence of a third successor, a mysterious figure allegedly chosen by the late Ayatollah for just such an emergency. This phantom leader was said to be a hardline cleric with deep ties to the intelligence services, a man who believed that the only way to save the revolution was to widen the conflict into a global holy war. Whether this figure actually existed or was a creation of Iranian psychological operations was irrelevant. The mere rumor of his presence was enough to keep the Iranian resistance forces fighting and the coalition forces on edge. The war was no longer about territory or regime change, it was about hunting a ghost in a landscape of fire. As the sun set on the fifth day of the conflict, the city of Tehran was a shadow of its former self. The carpet bombing, which the Pentagon claimed was targeted strictly at military infrastructure, had inevitably bled into residential areas, leaving tens of thousands of civilians dead or wounded. The hospitals that were still standing were overwhelmed, lacking medicine, electricity, and clean water. Yet, in the midst of this misery, a new form of resistance was emerging. Small, decentralized cells of the Basij militia, fueled by a mixture of religious fervor and nationalistic rage, were preparing for a ground invasion they were certain was coming. They did not need a supreme leader to tell them what to do. They had been trained for decades for this specific moment of martyrdom. The fall of the 10-minute leader had not broken the will of the state. It had only removed the last layer of restraint, leaving a nation of 80 million people with nothing to lose and a world of enemies to strike. As the plumes of radioactive dust and thick black smoke from the relentless airstrikes began to shroud the sun across the Iranian plateau, the world came to a chilling realization. The elimination of the 10-minute leader had not brought about the swift regime collapse that Washington's strategic models had predicted. Instead, it had triggered a primal and far more devastating defense mechanism, a power structure that no longer possessed a singular head but was omnipresent in its reach. In the halls of power in Washington, the initial euphoria of the decapitation campaign was quickly replaced by a creeping dread. Intelligence reports confirmed the emergence of a new entity, dubbed by experts as the Shadow Successor. This was not a single individual who could be pinpointed by a cruise missile, but a supreme council of radical clerics and high-ranking intelligence officers who had survived the initial onslaught. They had sworn to transform Iran into a massive graveyard for any invading force, signaling a shift from conventional defense to a doctrine of total nihilistic resistance. The coalition's ground invasion, initially presented by the White House as a swift liberation march, slammed into an impenetrable wall of resistance within its first hours. As armored units and Marine battalions pushed into the outskirts of major cities like Tehran and Isfahan, they did not face a regular army waiting to be pulverized by superior firepower. Instead, they were lured into a lethal labyrinth of sophisticated, improvised explosive devices, swarms of low-cost but highly effective suicide drones, and thousands of snipers who appeared and vanished like ghosts among the ruins. Every home, every school, and every mosque had been weaponized. Coalition soldiers began to feel a crushing psychological weight, realizing they were no longer fighting a sovereign state with a chain of command, but an ideology pushed to the extreme edge of martyrdom. The battlefield was no longer defined by lines on a map, but by the unseen presence of an enemy that welcomed death as the ultimate victory. On the global stage, the economy began a violent contraction unprecedented in modern history. Crude oil prices, no longer governed by any law of supply and demand, surged past $260 per barrel in just 48 hours. This triggered chaos and energy riots in major cities across the globe, from Paris to Tokyo. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most vital energy artery, had become a graveyard. The burning husks of massive oil tankers sent up pillars of black smoke visible from the International Space Station. The United Nations remained paralyzed by endless shouting matches, as Russia and China began to openly denounce the American actions as a blatant violation of international law. They threatened direct military countermeasures if a ceasefire was not established immediately. Yet, in the White House Situation Room, new orders continued to flow out with the singular goal of crushing all resistance, despite the human cost rising by the minute. The drama of the war reached a new peak when the Shadow Successor delivered its first message through a network of low-power mobile radio stations. The voice, cold and devoid of fear, declared that Iran had prepared for this apocalyptic moment for over 40 years and would never kneel before the power of Western bombs. This message acted as a lightning rod for the entire network of Iranian proxies across the Middle East. From Hezbollah strongholds in Lebanon to Houthi launch sites in Yemen, a fresh wave of cruise missiles and suicide drones was unleashed against American warships and the energy infrastructure of Gulf allies. The world watched in horror as the boundary between a regional war and a full-scale global conflict blurred into insignificance. The fall of the temporary leader had not ended the war. It had only stripped away the last layer of restraint, leaving the world to face a headless, vengeful giant that refused to die. As the calendar turned toward the final months of 2026, the smoke over the ruins of Tehran had become a permanent fixture of the global horizon. The decapitation strike, once hailed as a masterstroke of military precision, was now being scrutinized as the greatest strategic miscalculation of the 21st century. The United States and its allies had successfully erased the head of the Islamic Republic, but in doing so, they had unleashed a hydra. The ground invasion had slowed to a bloody crawl, with coalition forces controlling only the scorched skeletons of major cities, while the vast, rugged interior remained firmly in the hands of the Ghost Council and its decentralized insurgent cells. The promise of a swift liberation had dissolved into a Pyrrhic victory, where the price of control was a constant stream of casualties and a defense budget that was bleeding the American economy dry. In Washington, the political landscape was fractured as the initial cheers of victory were replaced by mass protests and a haunting sense of déjà vu, reminding many of the long, inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but on a much more catastrophic scale. The global consequences of the chaotic rise and instant fall of Iran's temporary leadership were now felt in every household across the planet. With oil prices stubbornly hovering near $300 per barrel, the global supply chain had effectively snapped. The era of cheap consumer goods and easy travel ended overnight, replaced by an era of rationing and economic depression. In Europe, the influx of millions of Middle Eastern refugees fleeing the scorched earth of the Iranian plateau had triggered a political crisis that threatened the very existence of the European Union. Meanwhile, Russia and China, having filled the diplomatic vacuum left by the collapse of Western-Iranian relations, had solidified their own alternative alliance, further isolating the United States on the world stage. The war that was supposed to bring stability to the Middle East had instead acted as a catalyst for a new, multipolar world order defined by scarcity, suspicion, and the constant threat of nuclear escalation. Inside Iran, the 10-minute leader had already become a tragic footnote, a symbol of the brief moment when the old world died and the new, darker world was born. The Islamic Republic as a centralized nation-state had ceased to exist, replaced by a patchwork of warlords, religious fanatics, and desperate resistance groups. The humanitarian toll was beyond calculation, with the civilian death toll reaching hundreds of thousands and the cultural heritage of one of the world's oldest civilizations reduced to rubble. The ghost of the late Ayatollah and his short-lived successor haunted the mountains, as the shadow successor continued to broadcast messages of eternal struggle, ensuring that the fire of the revolution would continue to burn even if the country itself was ashes. There was no one left to sign a peace treaty, no government to recognize, and no end in sight for a conflict that had taken on a life of its own. As we look back at the events of 2026, the lesson remains a grim warning for future generations. The belief that a nation can be liberated by simply removing its leaders, without understanding the deep-seated ideologies and the complex social structures that sustain them, is a dangerous illusion. The 10-minute leader was not just a victim of a missile strike, he was a symptom of a world that prioritizes immediate tactical success over long-term strategic wisdom. The ruins of Tehran stand today as a silent monument to the limits of military power and the unpredictable nature of human resistance. The Middle East remains a landscape of ghosts, where the echoes of the fallen leaders continue to drown out any hope for a lasting peace. The war did not end with the fall of the palace. It merely entered its most dangerous phase, leaving a world that is less secure, more divided, and forever changed by the fire that was ignited in a single morning of majestic rage